Once upon a time, there was a handsome prince. Actually, that's a lie. He wasn't handsome at all. He was bald and ugly and his ears stuck out. And he talked to trees. But he was a real prince, and after all, that's all that matters. The prince loved a witch, and the witch loved him. But in those days, princes weren't allowed to marry witches. So the witch lived in her little cottage deep in the forest, and the prince visited her occasionally, well, frequently, for a cuddle. He did this for many years, until one day his mother, the old queen, came to visit him. "Son," she said, "it's time you got married." "But I'm not allowed," whined the prince. The old queen clicked her teeth in annoyance. "Not the witch," she said. You must marry a princess and have children to carry on the royal line after you and I are both gone." "I suppose you're right, mother," said the prince. "But whom shall I marry?" "Leave it to me," said the old queen. And so, that afternoon, the old queen and the witch set out together to find a suitable bride for the prince. The queen wanted someone of impeccable royal ancestry, a credit to the royal line. It would help if she was beautiful as well, so that she would have grandchildren, better looking than her ugly son. The witch wanted someone the prince would really, really hate. They soon found a princess who suited both of them. She was tall, young and beautiful. The people would love her, and she would give the queen many beautiful grandchildren. She was also whiny and attention-seeking, and the witch was sure the prince would loathe her on sight. The people went wild with delight when the princess was introduced to them. They lined the streets and cheered and talked of nothing else but how beautiful the princess was. Nothing like it had been seen in the kingdom since the old queen had herself been a young princess many years before. It was decided that the prince should marry her at once. The old queen's dressmaker made her a beautiful wedding gown from many yards of pure white silk. The witch promised to make an enchanted coach out of a pumpkin. Unfortunately, pumpkins were out of season, and she had to make do with an aubergine. The result was that the coach was smaller than the dress, which got horribly crumpled by the time the princess arrived at the church. Nobody seemed to mind. The princess was so nervous that she forgot the prince's name, but nobody cared about that either. Actually, as fairy tale weddings go, it went quite well. At least there was no evil fairy to pronounce a curse on the whole thing. But there might as well have been, as we shall see. The prince and the princess spent their honeymoon on the old queen's golden boat. The prince took along some big thick books so that he would have something to do. The princess soon presented the prince with two beautiful sons. The prince now thought that he had done all that could reasonably be expected of him, and resumed his trips to the little cottage in the forest for cuddles with the witch. The prince's father, the old duke, hated the princess, and one day they had a terrible argument. "You're only princess because you're married to my son," he said. "On the contrary, Duke," replied the princess, "you're only the old duke because you're married to the old queen." My ancestors were princes and princesses when yours were still working in the Terra Masalata mines. What's more, the old queen's grandmother made her husband prince consort, but our queen hasn't done that for you, has she? The princess fled the palace, never to return. The prince divorced her, and the old queen stripped her of all her royal titles. Fortunately, the princess had many friends to look after her. One was a clever doctor who could cure all manner of strange and disgusting diseases, though even he couldn't cure the prince's sticky-out ears. Another was a handsome lifeguard who wore leopard-skinned swimming trunks and kept the children safe from harm when they bathed in the sea. Yet another was the Empress of the Amazons, a flame-haired giantess who ran half-clad and shrieking through the streets at night, striking terror into all who saw her. But the princess's best friend was the Caliph of Kensington. He had an enchanted cave full of the most wonderful treasures, and he allowed the princess to help herself whenever she wanted. But what the princess liked best was the Caliph's handsome son, the Sultan. The Sultan would take the princess for rides on his magic carpets. But one night, with the stars glittering above and the lights of the fabled city of love far below, there was a terrible accident. The carpet ripped, and the Sultan and the princess fell to their deaths on the hard cobbles many hundreds of feet below. The people were grief-stricken, and they left so many bunches of flowers in front of the palace that it was almost buried. The heartbroken Caliph was convinced that the old Duke had ripped the underlay of the carpet with a Stanley knife, and said so to every policeman he met. But the old Queen ordered the police to take no notice. The entire kingdom fell silent on the day of the princess's funeral. The people lined the streets to watch the hearse go by, as full of grief as they had been with happiness only a few short years before, on the princess's wedding day. The princess's brother, the young Earl, stood up in the church and said he didn't see why the prince was there at all. He wasn't married to the princess when she died, and besides that, if he'd been a better husband, the princess wouldn't have gone off with the Sultan in the first place. The young Earl took the princess's body and buried her on a cold, bleak desert island, guarded by ice dragons, so nobody would ever step on it again. Afterwards, the prince called on the old queen. "Mother," he said, "I've done everything you required of me. Will you now change the law so I can marry the woman I love?" "I don't see why not," said the old queen. "Everything worked out quite well, considering." So the old queen changed the law, and the prince and the witch were married, and they lived happily ever after. But, although the witch was very happy in the palace, she kept her little cottage deep in the forest, just in case she needed it. Because you can never tell with princes.